Okay, thank you for attending. We're now going to begin the presentation by Greg Burns, Lusitania Medal in its varieties. But before I do so, to give a few minutes for people to sit down, I do have a special presentation that was done earlier this morning, and I'd like to do it today. And I would like to, my right up here, Lyle Anderson, current president of the California State Numismatic Association, to please come forward. I would like to have had Don Foster, who's president of the Numismatic Association of Southern California, but right now his duties, I presume, are struggling over there next with the exhibits. The ANA presents awards every year for publications. One of the goals under the presidency of Lyle Anderson and also Don Foster with the Numismatic Association of Southern California is that the California Numismaticists, as it is now currently titled and published, be recognized nationally. For those of us who've been members of CSNA going back 30 or more years, it has periodically. This morning at 8:30, I had the honor to receive an award. And Greg Burns, would you kindly come up here, please? My left. Greg Burns is the editor of the California Numismaticists. It gives me great privilege to present to you, and there's a little tongue-in-cheek in this because I'm going to have fun with you now, the first place in the outstanding regional numismatic publication from the American Numismatic Association, edited by David Gregory Burns.
Wait, I've got an appendage here somewhere. Where? Okay. Thank you, thank you. Well, I'll have fun with that, actually, and my ANA counterparts. I'll have a good poke at them. Thank you very much, Dan.
Congratulations.
This is doubly exciting because I'm one of his staff members.
Yes. Yeah, my advertising manager.
Yes.
Oh, assistant.
And my assistant editor here.
All right, Greg Burns, go ahead.
Oh, thank you, thank you. On the Lusitania medal and the various varieties associated with it. Thank you for coming today. I got started kind of in this very narrow specialty, admittedly, about 3 years ago. And well, actually the story goes back probably 20 or more years ago when reading one of the books by Stefanelli. It's a coffee table sized book, has a lot of beautiful pictures of medals and coins, paper money. Many of you might have seen it. It's the beauty and lore of coins and so forth. And somewhere in there, page 350, she's got a picture of this very odd medal that has a skeleton on one side, you know, at a ticket booth. And when I saw it, I thought, well, what an unusual topic. And it drew my eye in the book. And of course, this was 20-some odd years ago. And I ended up putting it away in the bookcase somewhere. I didn't really consult it too much after that. But about 3 years ago, I was at a local coin store, and they have a bid board. And sure enough, up on the bid board, one of the items I saw was one of these medals. And I thought, oh, I remember that. That was in Elvira Klein Stefanelli's book. So I bid the minimum bid, $20 or something on it, and went back the next week and sure enough won it. And I thought, oh boy, it's something to add to my collection, and it's very strange looking, and you know, what's the story behind that skeleton? Really didn't motivate me to go find out a whole lot about it at that point. And I probably would have just put it in a little slip and put it in my collecting chest somewhere and forgotten about it, except that just 2 months after that, I went to the CSNA convention in San Jose. And I happened to be walking along the Bourse floor, and I looked in the dealer's case, and he had 2 of these darn things. Well, I mean, somebody's, you know, knocking on my door saying, wake up, Greg, because here in 20 years' time, I've seen 3, and it's only been in the course of just a couple of months. So I ended up asking, well, how much are these? And the fellow wanted, like, I think 35 for one and 45 for the other. He didn't really know the story behind them. And I thought, well, gee, my funds are a little limited. I'll buy the cheaper one, $35. And I went away very happy with that and thought I was smart and so forth, saved myself 10 bucks. And later that night, we went to the banquet, and I kept kind of a little nagging thought in the back of my mind thinking, you know, Greg, if you don't go and you buy that other one, you're really going to kick yourself. Because the one thing that the dealer had known and pointed out to me, and maybe this is why he had 2 different prices, is that one had a date of May 5th on it, the other one had a date of May 7th. And I thought, well, gee, if there's more than one variety, I should probably try to get it. So I went back the next morning. Dealer was nowhere to be found at his table. I sat patiently, and I waited and waited. After about 15 or 20 minutes, he showed up. He gave me like $5 off because I was such a patient guy. And that is really what started me off on this journey of the Lusitania medal. So all fired up, I noticed now I had two different varieties, and when I got home I was able to compare them to the other one I had, and I saw that they're really quite different from each other. And the two that I bought, it turns out, I had just assumed that they were, you know, the very fairly common British propaganda pieces. They actually happened to be two genuine Goetz pieces, had the Goetz edge stamp on them, and were probably worth several $100s a piece. So that was my spark that got me started along this. And I've seen a whole bunch of medals. I immediately started looking for them on eBay and other places. And at this point, I've seen hundreds and hundreds and just done a tremendous amount of research. I'm going to try to condense, you know, several years of research for you down into just these topics here. I'll give you a very brief introduction to the man that kicked it off, Karl Goetz. He's a German medalist out of Munich. We're going to talk very little bit about the Lusitania, which was the Cunard liner for the British. The start of the Great War, World War I. What was the involvement of the Lusitania in all of this? And why did Goetz make his first medal to begin with? And I say first because he made more than one variety. There's also a British copy, Goetz's second variety that we'll talk about, an American copy made in Pennsylvania, and what other copies of the medal are out there. There's also a lot of ephemera. You know, if you were here earlier for Sarah Norden's talk about prison tokens, she said one of the things that kind of pulled at her once she started collecting prison tokens was like postcards. And sure enough, you know, I've got a book here. I'll show you some of the ephemera that goes along with this. Propaganda leaflets, and there's postcards and posters and all kinds of different things that are associated with war and the events of it and so forth. And then I'll also kind of go over some other resources you might want to consult if you'd like to read a little further. First off, Karl Goetz, again, lived to the ripe old age of 75. And Karl was, I guess, brought of age in a time that was fairly tumultuous in Europe, and especially in Germany. You know, they had these various wars for unification of the German states. And anyways, he was known for his satirical medals. That's probably the genre that he's most famous for. He did a lot of other medals too, anniversary medals, general medals of popular topics and themes of the day. Did most of his training in Germany. He did spend a few years in Paris, but eventually settled in Munich, which is where he lived the remainder of his life. Günther Keinest is, and I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right, but Scott, do you have an alternate pronunciation for me? Okay, it's as close as I get anyways. Anyways, he chronicled you know, almost 800 different varieties of medals that Goetz produced, and 175 or so with satirical themes. And those satirical ones are my favorite because they're the most biting comment on human nature and the passions that drive people. By the late 1940s, Günther had difficulty continuing to work, although he would continue to strike medals from his cabinet if people ordered them. And again, by the time he died at 75, his right side was paralyzed. He wasn't too effective at that point. The Lusitania, built starting in 1905 in Scotland, launched 12 months later. It was the fastest, most powerful, biggest ship at the time. 32,000 tons displacement. It had 4 steam turbines, one of the earlier ships to utilize this form of power, and then almost unheard of 68,000 horsepower. I mean, an enormous advancement over some of the other ships of the time. Its maximum speed was 25 knots plus, maybe a little bit more if they kicked all the stops off the boilers and so forth. The Blue Ribbon was an award given to the fastest ship that could make a crossing. And the next year here in 1907, after a decade of German dominance, the Lusitania retook the Blue Ribbon. You'll recall that the British, especially at this time, turn of the century, this was the 19th century and the conclusion into the early 20th century, the British pride, their great might was in their naval power. So this decade of the Germans having held this blue ribbon was particularly distasteful, I think, to the British ego. And the government, Great Britain and Cunard conspired or collaborated, perhaps is a better word, in terms of producing the Lusitania. A lot of the funding came from the British government and so forth, with the stipulation that if there were a time of war, of course the British government could use the Lusitania for cargo, troop transport, or whatever. And this was something that, in light of the favorable economic conditions, the Cunard Line certainly agreed to. Now, Europe at the time, remember we talked about this environment that grew up in or came of age in. A lot of alliances struck up between various countries. Hey, you watch my back, I'll watch yours. France and Russia had a very close alliance. A lot of folks were supporting of the Belgian neutrality or independence. Austria-Hungary had a huge alliance with Germany. Italy also had an alliance with Germany. So folks had these interlocking relationships that were in their nature adversarial. And as it turns out, in 1914, the Archduke Francis Ferdinand, was assassinated. And Serbia was one of those lands that he was aspiring to come and be king, and they didn't much care for that, and there was a subset of insurgents. They had kind of a comedy of errors in terms of trying to assassinate him. The first time when he was coming from the train station to the city hall, and I think here's where he's disembarking after the first assassination attempt, somebody threw a hand grenade at his car. It bounced off, blew up, hit the car behind him, and he, of course, raced along the street, or his driver did, to get him to the town hall. Nowadays, they'd probably say, well, let's rethink all of our security protocols for the remainder of the day. But I guess they weren't real familiar with terrorism back then, and they, again, kept right on with the day's events, which included taking him from here to someplace else. And along that route, of course, somebody stepped out at a corner where the car slowed down with a handgun, fired 2 shots, killed him and his wife. So Austria-Hungary took great exception to that and said, well, I'll tell you what, you let us come in, we're going to do our investigation, we'll have all our police powers, we'll go where we want, do what we want, interrogate who we want under any conditions we want. And they threw other rather unfavorable or onerous conditions on their investigation. And Serbia said, well, okay, you can do this, you can do that, you can bring your people in. But they said, there's a couple of things you can't do. And on that pretext that, well, Serbia is not cooperating, a month later, Austria-Hungary declared war. Well, I remember all we had this house of cards of interrelated alliances. When Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, well, that means that Russia, who had an alliance with Serbia, they said, we're going to go and we'll help defend your Serbian nationality. And of course, as soon as Russia jumped into the fray, they had an alliance with France, and that obligated France to join in. And Austria-Hungary had an alliance with Germany. That means Germany had to join in. So pretty soon you had all of Europe that had kind of tumbled into this huge conflict here, what eventually would mean millions and millions of deaths. So Germany, when they were thinking of that, hey, how do we defend ourselves against the real threat here, which is France? Along the French-German border, they had many years of hostility, established enmity for each other, and they had quite a set of impressive defenses on both sides of the French-German border. So Germany scratched their head and they said, you know what, if we go up north a little bit through our northern border with Belgium, they don't have an army worth sneezing at. They're mostly, waiters and beer makers. We can certainly go into there very easily and then come down through their border into France, which is largely unprotected. It'll be a very quick, we'll be rolling into Paris in weeks. And that's exactly what they were thinking. It's going to be weeks. This war is going to be quick, fast. Back in those days, war was primarily between armies. It didn't really involve civilian populations. You didn't have people, burning towns or shooting civilians. It was mostly the kind of Revolutionary War images that I know I grew up with. Is, the British Army would all march up in a row, and the first row would fire and fall down, and the second row would do that, and it's kind of a civilized, formal approach to it. And this is exactly what Germany thought. We've got these great armaments we've been building up. We had our own unification conflicts that we've had that fueled our military infrastructure. So they felt very confident it was going to be a short war. Well, guess again. It very quickly devolved into primarily trench warfare. The Western Front is a famous term. And these guys would dig in trenches, and they'd have places of defense where they really didn't move much over the ensuing years. A few miles here, a few miles there, back and forth. But there really wasn't any progress by Germany on the ground war. And France wasn't able to make much progress either. So remembering that the British, they prided themselves on this fantastic naval power that they really commanded at that moment, the world's greatest naval power. They said, how can we turn that to our advantage? This is something that we're not doing anything here on the ground that's very, very important. What else can we do? And Germany has a very small northern coast through which they can import and export various goods. And it's an important part of the German economy at the time, and I assume now also. So the British said, let's concentrate our naval power on running a blockade there. And we'll stop all the imports of food and machinery and the raw materials for making war weapons, and we won't give Germany any way to export goods so that they have difficulty fueling their economy. And that was a huge frustration to the Germans at the time. They claimed they were being starved and what atrocity, and indeed the British played their strength very heavy-handedly. If you had an American ship with food on it and you wanted to sell it to somebody and dock at the northern German ports there, the British simply wouldn't let you. They'd say, well, I'm sorry, that's war contraband. We'll divert you to one of our allied ports, and sorry, you can't take it into Germany. And there's virtually no trade going on there with that northern German coast. And if you're a German, of course, this is a kind of a stinging reality. You got to figure out, what are you going to do with it? And their response was to declare a war zone around the entire British Isles. Now, up until that time, submarines were largely thought of as a defensive, coastal defensive weapon. It really, nobody had done much else with them at the time, and Germany was soon to change that, having declared that as a war zone around the British Isles on the day of sailing, May 1st, 1915. The German embassy had a notice published in the papers that came out right alongside, in some cases, the Cunard sailing schedule. And basically it said, if you're going to get on a British ship and you're going to go into that war zone, you may find yourself swimming. And sure enough, 7 days later, that's exactly what happened. The German submarine U-20, captained by Walter Schweiger, fired a single torpedo, struck the Lusitania, and in 18 minutes, the liner sunk. Now, most of the ephemera, and I'll show you some of these boxes and literature and so forth, they talk about 1,198 people dying. And this is out of 1,951 formally registered passenger and crew. The real number is 1,201, and the discrepancy of 3 comes about because when the vessel was departing New York Harbor, the practice at that time was to conduct a search, look for any stowaways, and if you find them, you can at least put them off on another ship, take them back to the authorities before you leave the harbor. And sure enough, they found 3 stowaways, which, interestingly enough, they appeared to be German-speaking people, and they had camera equipment with them. And so they said, well, these must be German spies. So they didn't put them off. They locked them up below decks to take them back to England to be interrogated. The camera was offloaded to a British war vessel just outside, I think, well, still in American waters. And I've never been able to find out what happened to that camera. Anybody developed the film? What did they find? The supposition was that perhaps these German agents were looking for evidence that the Lusitania may have been armed, which would make it a formal war vessel, or perhaps trying to find the nature of what materials it was transporting, hoping perhaps to illustrate that it was carrying contraband in defiance of American regulations as well as other international law. So anyways, that's why there's 1,201, not 1,198, because those three didn't make it either. Anyways, the world reaction, I mean, it was absolutely in shock. You know, the war up until that time was primarily army against army, and here for the first time you really had a significant loss of life related to purely a civilian population. So there were many things that came out that spoke of the barbarism of the German government in this sinking and in relation to other events. Well, Goetz, I'm sure he was sitting at home in Munich drinking his coffee, and of course he's on the other side of the conflict. He doesn't see it as being such an indictment against German barbarism. He says, well, wait a second, Cunard Line, let's see, you're transporting small arms cartridges, and they were. It was well known. They had some, I don't know, 5,000 cases of Enfield rifle ammunition. So you're transporting people on a vessel carrying war materials. Gee, that's a little bit of a hypocrisy, isn't it? You're paying passengers on a warship. And so he made this design here very quickly and got it to market probably 2-3 months after the fact, and made just a small little error. He did make several errors in many of his pieces. We'll talk about a couple of them. First off, the reverse here, at the top in German it says business above all. Again, pointing out that you know, the interests of the Cunard Line were not in protecting people's lives as it was just making money. You know, we're going to be going back and forth, let's transport some war goods, we'll try to get some unsuspecting passengers on board, sell them tickets. So here's this skeleton in this ticket booth, you know, representing death, selling tickets to get on the Lusitania. You see over here a man reading a newspaper. Newspaper says, U-boat danger. And he's got a look of, I guess, shock on his face. And right next to him in the top hat, wagging a finger, is a picture of the German ambassador, kind of alluding to, you know, the warning that the German government had printed in the paper. The obverse says no contraband in German on the top. It shows the Lusitania sinking beneath the waves. There's images of war materials, airplanes, cannons, and other things slipping off the side. Again, wants to make it very plain that this was a warship carrying contraband. And down at the bottom under the exurge, it has the liner Lusitania sunk by a German submarine, 5th of May, 1915. And, you know, oops, got the date wrong. Now, Goetz did this in a number of other cases. One, you'd think, my goodness, how did he live to be 75? He got Hitler's name spelled wrong on a medal, put 2 T's in it. He had, I think, the number of Red Baron, had the number of his victories misstated on the medal honoring him, and a number of other things. He, you know, those are just facts, not as important as the main theme. And indeed, I really don't think they were. Anyways, the British said, well, gosh, you know, he's saying the 5th of May on his medal, and it really happened the 7th of May. Let's use that to our advantage. So the propaganda that they put out was that the Germans had conspired to commit this murder, not as an act of war, kind of ad hoc at the moment while on the open seas, but they had planned it out well in advance. Let's go kill us some civilians. And oh, by the way, we'll make a medal to celebrate the death of all these innocents. At least this is what the British were trying to portray the medal as. So the way they wanted to portray it really is premeditated murder. Now, most of the British copies use the spelling M-A-Y, and a gentleman here had a medal, was it you, sir? Had one with the M-A-I. That is a very scarce British copy. Most of them use the M-A-Y spelling, but they're all iron. I've never seen a genuine British copy in anything but iron. I've seen lots of counterfeit British copies in all kinds of alloy, lead, bronze, what have you. But all of them were die-cast, permanent molds, molten iron. They're all poor in quality. Iron doesn't flow and finish as well as bronze does. So they're usually very identifiable by the looks. You pick them up and right away, if you've looked at hundreds and hundreds, and I have, you know right away what they are. The British department store owner, Selfridge, produced some 300,000 copies. So, I mean, you know, there's plenty of them around for anybody who's interested in. They did sell them in a little box with a pamphlet, and I'll show you some examples of those pamphlets, and I've got some up front here also that you can look at. And they'd sell them for $1 a piece, and they sent the profits to one of the seamen's charities, or, you know, try to make kind of the high road of it instead of just pulling in money. Well, Goetz became aware that this propaganda machine had started up and said, oops, yeah, I guess I got the wrong date on there. I better go fix that. And indeed came out with a second variety where he's corrected the date to 7th of May. Everything else is pretty much the same. Between those two Goetz varieties, the first one, the May 5th one, is much more scarce than the May 7th. And in part, I think that is because up until his death, if you wanted a medal that Goetz had originally produced, you know, 30 years earlier, you simply had to order it. You still had the master. He'd go make some copies. Here, sell you one, no problem. So I'm sure his ego would have prevented him, even if he had one available, of reproducing one with the incorrect date. You know, he had been castigated enough by his contemporaries. His government kind of, you know, well, tell us a little bit about this wrong date business, because it was a thorn in their side. They realized there was a propaganda war and that this didn't really fit in well. So I think that once he made the change, I suspect he didn't make any more of the 5th May variety. Now, Scott, you mentioned you saw an iron example, and those are very scarce. I've only seen one iron Goetz piece. You know, he used the French sand method of production, and bronze is a nice flowable material. The alloy is a good material for a medallist to work with. Iron is not. It tends to be porous. It doesn't flow as well. And during the war, though, the German Bavarian War Office said, well, bronze, I'm afraid, is a strategic war material. You can't use it for something as frivolous as producing metals. And I know that for at least some part of his time then, Goetz converted all his production over to iron. Kynas did report also having a silver version, which, you know, I'd love to find out where that is. I'd love to buy it, but I haven't seen it yet. Most of the ones, well, I don't know that most, some of the ones that I've seen that are genuine Goetz have this edge stamping on the side here, ostensibly to discourage counterfeiting. I'm not really sure why. I do know that there's a significant number that don't have the edge stamp. So it's not its absence isn't an indication of counterfeit, but its presence, so far as I've seen, is always an indication that what you've got is a good metal.
Is that true 5th of May and 7th of May? You know,
Yes.
Is the edge stamp sometimes there on the 5th of May and sometimes there on the 7th of May?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Now, you know, just as there were a lot of inflamed passions on the European continent, over here there were people interested on both sides. There were pro-Germans, pro-Allies, and so forth. Well, two fellas, Sandstrom and Mahood, decided that they would take some advantage of this, and if you know, the British folks could sell some medals with some little boxes and literature and make a buck at it, they figured they could too. And if they were able to persuade people towards the Allies' cause in the same stroke, you know, so much the better. So in 1918, just prior to the armistice, as a matter of fact, these two folks got together. Clarence Mahood, he is really quite an entrepreneur. He started out with proprietor of the Peerless Press, working, you know, a printing press, stationery supply, that type of thing. Later on, developed into both a record store, radio sales and repair, and I think in later years, maybe even a television, very early television repair store. Gustav Sandstrom, just a common laborer. He had some experience at a metalworking place, and in his later years, I think he worked at the state hospital there in Warren County. But between the two of them, I think Mahood was probably more likely the one that brought the entrepreneurial, hey, let's go do this plan to it, and you know, I'll print up these brochures, I'll have these boxes made and so forth. And I suspect Sandstrom was probably the one that actually did maybe this dye work or prepared or the way for the production of the metals. Anyways, they're very easily identifiable. You notice that the lettering here has kind of this rounded look to it, and much of the engraving of that die does also. The one feature I find most telling is just this goofy looking pumpkin-headed skeleton here. I mean, he's got this goofy smile on his face, and so when you see that, you know right away it's one of the Sandstrom and Mahood copies. They are very scarce, much more so than the British copies, which are pretty common, the MAI spelling being the exception. And, but they're nowhere near as scarce as genuine Goetz pieces. I have just recently, it's strange, up until 2 months ago, I've probably seen maybe, I don't know, 4 or 5 of these over the course of 3+ years. And just about 2 months ago, I became aware of 2 different people in Pennsylvania that have like, a stash of 5 or a stash of 9 in the unopened envelopes. So, you know, after cleaning my trousers, I said, sell them to me, sell them to me. So I'm still in the middle of negotiating some of that. We'll see if I'm able to or not. I did get a couple. Anyways, they had a volume discount. Instead of in addition to 50 cents a pop, I think you got a dozen for $3 or something like that. Other copies, well, Guido Goetz, Karl Goetz's son, apparently in the 1970s authorized a Japanese firm to take some of Karl's originals from his metals cabinet and produce copies. And I know Joel Anderson, Lila's husband, had commented that he remembers a salesman pitching these things at, I don't know, 25 bucks a pop or something like that. Find me one. I've seen one on eBay in 3 years' time, and some dirty son of a gun bid it up to like 300 something, and I just, I had no idea it would go that high. I bid like 250 and said, I stop, I give up. I really doubt that the person that bid on it knew what it was they were bidding on. They probably thought, well, this is a Goetz piece. Well, it isn't. It's one of the Japanese copies, but I'll be darned, I can't find one. So I guess if I had a chance to spend 300 a day, I probably would. Huh? If you find one, please do. It's interesting that your husband mentioned that he thought that somewhere around the skeleton there was some Japanese characters or whatever. This is a photograph here of the Japanese version. I don't see anything like that, so I don't know if that's just maybe some copies, not others. It's an unexplored, kind of an unknown area for me right now. There are a couple of folks, though, that are in current production with Goetz, or especially the Lusitania metal counterfeit pieces. One is Der Dienst here in America. I sent something to the Secret Service saying, hey, you know what, they're violating the Hobby Protection Act. They're producing these copies of a numismatic item. Look up the 67 Act, you'll see it's classified as a numismatic item. And they're still selling them, so I'm sure my email went into the netherworld. Brian Cross over in the UK also has one. He at least has the decency to mark a small R on the knee of one of the gentlemen there to indicate that it's a reproduction. The R is so small, though, unless you get a glass out, you're never going to see it. And then it seems like, I've got a lot of examples here of other counterfeits. People make them with lead, they make them out of bronze. I think every kid in high school over in Britain probably had a metals class and said, hey, I'll make a copy of Dad's old medal here. And I bought a certain number of those. What are the diagnostics for telling the different varieties? First off, magnetic. All the British ones are going to be magnetic. They're all iron. With rare exception, none of the genuine Goetz pieces are going to be magnetic because most of them are bronze, with the exception of the silver one that I heard about from Gunther Keinast and obviously the few iron ones that were produced during those war years when the regulations were in effect. The casting quality, the visual appearance, the British, again, those copies are very rough and crude. The dies degraded over this fairly long production run. They don't have anywhere near the visual quality to them. So when you look at a genuine Goetz, with very few exceptions, they're a very high quality casting. The edge markings, again, the absence of them doesn't mean necessarily a whole lot. The presence of them, so far as I know, so far, indicate a genuine Goetz output. Patina and patination secrets were kind of a closely guarded thing among the various medallists. I'm sure that Goetz probably tried various formulas or recipes for his, but most of them have a very particular look. Weight, that's not quite usually so close an indicator as specific gravity. I talk about specific gravity. I've charted the weight in air and weight in water for all of my specimens, so I calculate specific gravity in all of them, and I find that the Goetz pieces, with rare exception, fall in a very narrow band, as do the British iron reproductions. Of course, that's a different alloy, but a lot of times I'll come up with somebody will say, well, here's a Goetz piece, and some of the diagnostics will be just a little off. The look isn't quite right. You look at the edge of it, third side of the coin, right, and it won't have that look that Goetz did with his finishing techniques. I'll go do a specific gravity calculation, and sure enough, every time it'll show up as either being too high or too low, and it'll be a good tiebreaker for me. Anyways, there's a few other items related to design characteristics and so forth that also are helpful in attributing them. Talked a little bit about the ephemera that gets associated with these. In Britain, they produce this series of boxes. I've got some up front here you can take a peek at. And you can see it's got, a pretty denigrating statement of what it is that the British would like you to think the Germans were doing, and trying to put the official touch, the German government, on this medal, which of course it wasn't. It was a private production. There are quite a number of pamphlets that were also distributed with those. Like a lot of ephemera, this is the more delicate of all of those three, the medal, the box, the pamphlet, and they're much more difficult to come by in any kind of decent condition. They do have quite a number of languages. Finding them in anything other than English is very, very difficult. I've acquired the one in French, and I think I've got the one in Spanish. I'm hoping to get this one in German. Peter Nelson. Oh, I shouldn't have said that name. Somebody will get a hold of him. Peter Nelson over in Great Britain. He's a noted author on Lord Nelson and various medallic and postcard things. That son of a gun has the only German copy of the pamphlet that I know of, and I'm trying to get him to sell that to me. We'll see if I convince him. Our American friends, they also had quite a bit of ephemera associated with theirs. There was at least two styles of presentation that they made. One is they'd take this medal, they'd put it in this smaller envelope, and then they'd fold in this double-sided printed pamphlet and slip both the small envelope and the pamphlet into a larger envelope. And that's one means they had of packaging them up for sale. And I have seen once, and again, too slow on eBay, I guess, I have seen once there's a box that they put out. And I don't have one. That's a photograph that I ripped off eBay. The seller that had it, some other lucky stiff captured that one. Oh, if I could go back in time. A lot of other propaganda besides medals and boxes and things. There were quite a number of cartoons playing in all the publications of the day. The central red one is one that Gunther had set aside and mailed me some years ago. And it shows this arrogant Kaiser Wilhelm III walking past an astounded Woodrow Wilson, who in disbelief is looking at these gold coins that he's tossing kind of as his feet. Here's money for your Americans, I may drown some more. So like all propaganda, they tried to, these pieces displayed the enemies of them in some despicable fashion. A lot of posters that featured the Lusitania. You see a maniacal British figure here urging somebody to take up the sword as the Lusitania sinks in the background. Irishmen avenged the Lusitania. So again, trying to one, both inflame the passions of people and influence them. I like this one down here at the bottom, where the devil is putting his arm around the Kaiser, saying, "Hey, you're a pretty good guy. I admire you and your work on that Lusitania." Again, I get pulled in a lot of different directions. If I see postcards having to do with the Lusitania or the medals, I'll go nuts for those. I'm sure most of you end up, you may have one specialty, but very often you get pulled into other directions that appeal to your collecting instincts. I also found that there's quite a number of stamps associated with both the Lusitania. These are all Cinderellas, meaning that they're not formal stamps with a monetary value. They were used simply to seal the edge of an envelope or something along that line. This block of 4 here was, it's kind of scarce to get it in the complete block, but it shows the Lusitania sinking on this one, says, "Remember the Lusitania," exhorting folks. There's a story of Edith Cavell, a British nurse who was helping Belgian refugees. She ran like a little hospital and so forth up in Belgium, which was absolutely torn apart by the Germans. And anyway, she would help occasionally some of the people that she was, trying to save their lives, help them to escape. And the Germans said, "Well, you're a conspirator." They took her out and shot her. So that was another thing that kind of offended the common sensibilities of people at the time. And, I don't know, if you can look sideways, there's a little boy being consoled by his father as his mother's under this sheet covered on the bed, dead. It's talking about the Zeppelin triumph when they were, the German Zeppelins were bombing villages. And they're saying, "But Mommy had done nothing wrong, had she, Daddy?" Oh, such a heart-wrenching scene. So, a lot of propaganda going on. Further resources, Gunter Kindness produced 2 books, The Medals of Karl Goetz in '67, and then a supplement to it in '86. And, it's an unfortunate comment, but in conversing or corresponding with him, he said that this second one, which, these are hard books to come by. You'll spend, I think you can buy a new one of the first issue. Who's got it? It's a guy in Illinois. Does a lot of exonumia sales. He's got them for $100 shrink wrapped. And the Goetz 2, that's a very difficult one to come by, and you'll spend probably $150 to get a lousy used one. Gunter told me that was such a poor sale, he took like crates of them and threw them in the trash. Wish I had them today. Colin Simpson wrote the book, The Lusitania. It was a very expose-style book. It was critical of the British government and made a lot of allusions that perhaps they were in some secretive way involved. There were some comments made by Winston Churchill and King George at the time that in conversations with people, what do you think America would do if the Lusitania were sunk and Americans were on it? And this was before the fact, so, these hints of conspiracy, Colin Simpson certainly lays those all out and, let you draw your own conclusions. But it's a very interesting book, and he's got a lot of facts. It's good for checking things. Well, a little bit after that, Thomas Bailey and Paul Ryan, I think they were probably offended by the allusions in Simpson's book. They wrote The Lusitania Disaster, and they specifically addressed, well, we don't believe this because of that. And they show a different point of view. And I've read them both. They're both good, very good books. There was a contemporary writing, I think it came out just a couple of months after the sinking, Charles Laureate. He was a Boston bookseller. He was on the Lusitania. You can't get a better account than the guy that was actually there. And he went down with the ship, and he somehow struggled to get on a lifeboat, saved some other people along with him, and wrote a very interesting first-hand account of his adventures. And that's about half the book. The second half of the book is an accounting of the British follow-up and the aftermath investigation. So he takes, I think, a very critical point of view towards the authorities of the time, and also of the Cunard Line's involvement, and gee, were they prepared? There's a lot of slipshod seamanship. Really, when you read the first-hand accounting of it, they had some idiot in a lifeboat that pulled a gun and said, "You're going to let this lifeboat go," because the captain said, "No, hold on to it." You know, the ship's leaning over, and this guy says, "Nope, you know, let it loose." Excuse me, sir? Okay. Anyways, an idiot with a gun, like an idiot with a doorknob. Idiot with a gun, he's pointing at the seaman, he says, you know, cut this lifeboat loose, and of course the guy did, and it's leaning the wrong way, it falls on the deck, it slides down, it's slaughtered. I mean, these things weigh 10,000 pounds. I mean, people were getting ground up underneath it. So you just had a travesty of people dying. And that's why there was such a high death. 1,951 passengers, 1,201 died. Okay, well, that's a very high loss of life, and the 18-minute, which is an extremely short period of time for a sinking. I mean, more often than not, German torpedoes would bounce off or fail to fire, you know, for one to actually hit, explode, and then sink a vessel of the size of the Lusitania in 18 minutes was unthinkable at the time. Anyways, Google, that's always a winner if you're looking for information. You can get good information, you can get bad information, but at least you can get something to follow up on. eBay, you know, obviously I do a lot of my looking on eBay. I walk around the Bourse floor here and I say, got any Lusitania stuff? And a lot of times you just don't find it. So, you know, it gives me a very broad net to cast with when I go to the internet. I do have a website, lusitaniametal.com. I'll have a copy of this presentation on there as well as some other information. Please go there if you'd like. And last but not least, my pending book, the Lusitania Medallist Varieties. I'll have, you know, biographies of the characters and some of those, what I felt were the most interesting and compelling stories of the people that were involved and some of the events that took place, both with the ship and the medal and all those folks that produced them and so forth. I used to have on the version of this presentation coming out summer of 2004. So if that gives you any indication, you know, I've decided to scrub that off now. I'm not quite sure when it'll be out, but at some point in the future. In the meantime, are there any questions?
Questions?
Yeah, how was Goetz able to produce the Lusitania medal in bronze if bronze couldn't be used because of restrictions to use metal?
I don't know when that prohibition actually came into effect. It obviously was sometime after that, or he was flaunting that. I would guess he probably wasn't flaunting a direct German order. But I haven't been able to establish the boundaries of that period in which the Bavarian War Office said, yep, you can only produce in iron. So, not sure about that.
He never produced, well, except with the possible exception of a couple rare instances where he may have produced something in iron and then the one in silver. Basically everything that is original Goetz is bronze.
Yep. Yep. Well, now, you know, again, he did, you know, what, 784 other medals. Yeah, Lusitania, yeah, all the ones I've seen are in bronze. I have seen one in iron. It's a 7th May. Is this 7th May? Yeah, I think it must be. And yeah, if you find one in iron, let me know about it. I'm a buyer, you know. If you find one in silver, I'm definitely a buyer. I'll take out a mortgage.
Did they ever salvage the Lusitania?
No, it's 300 feet below the waters of the, just off about 10 miles, 13 miles off the old head of Kinsale, off the west coast of Ireland, southwest coast of Ireland.
She is on her side. She's sitting on her
She's
side.
on her side. A man named John Lightfoot bought salvage rights for $3,000, I think, in the 60s. There have been many dives made on it. For a long time, the British government would send warships out and they'd say, oh, don't be around here. Scoot, scoot. And in a matter of fact, they used to send depth charges down there. And you think, well, gee, were they trying to hide something? Well, Lightfoot did some dives down there once he bought the salvage rights. I think there's been a couple of other expeditions. They're never going to get it up. It's in such a decrepit condition, it'd fall to pieces. But interestingly enough, I think the results of those visual observations when people have been down there, they've said, well, you know, it does look like there was only one torpedo, only one scene of damage. It's not like there's such extensive damage that there was like cargo that blew up, which was a popular theory at the time. Is, you know, and the Germans promulgated this. You know, they loved this theory that the Lusitania was transporting so much war material that this one little piddly torpedo blew it all up, and really it's their own fault. No evidence of that.
What's the story on those two photos, the one of it being hit and then the one of it sinking?
A man named John Marshall did those. You can buy large posters of them. I bought one, paid, I don't know, $25 for it or something like that. He does a lot of... no, oh, absolutely not. Nobody was around then. No, they're paintings. He does marvelous work. He does a lot of paintings of ships and disasters.
Marshall.
And John Marshall, I believe.
He does a lot of Titanic.
Yeah, right.
A lot of Titanic pictures.
Yeah.
And the two vessels are often compared. There are a lot of comparisons between the two vessels, and there are all kinds of stories. There was a Vanderbilt on the
Alfred Vanderbilt.
yeah, on the Lusitania, who has heard us saying, "Why fear death? It is the most beautiful thing."
Yeah, and that was a quote.
Yeah.
At the time. Mm-hmm.
Fascinating subject. I belong to the Titanic Historic Society, and we often get corresponding articles on the Lusitania. The legend is her bottom's blown out, and they've gone down, and everything down there. But there's an interesting thing, and Goetz alluded to it, I think, and you're better on this, in another medal. In the 1920s, the Weimar Republic quietly told the British government, why don't we just settle this by sending somebody down and seeing what she did have? And the British government said, no way.
Yeah, no, this was not a popular option with them for a long time. As a matter of fact, the supposition is that even today they kind of repress anything to bring materials up and so forth. Oh, I'm going to mention one more thing. Just hold on just a second, Stan. I talked about Gunter Kynast's book. We have here today Scott Goodman, who has bought the copyright to them, and at some point has the great aspiration to republish what is a very interesting and important resource, and there just aren't enough copies of it around. So thank you, Scott, for taking that on.
Anyway, Greg, my boss, because you're the editor,
Sure.
a little certificate
Thank you.
and a little thing that you can write on the badge. It says your speaker.
I'm a speaker.